students. In my previous lecture, we have discussed about the development of the face. Today, we will discuss about the development of the nasolacrimal duct along with the development of the nasal cavities. The nasolacrimal duct develop as a furrow, which is a fusion line between the lateral nasal process along with the maxillary process, and this furrow we also call them as a nasolacrimal groove. This complete groove as well as the furrow is lined by the ectoderm. Now, the cells from the surface ectoderm, they proliferate and develops into the solid ectodermal cord. Now, this solid ectodermal cord detaches itself from the surface ectoderm and then it forms the nasolacrimal duct. Now, after the detachment, the process of canalization occurs, which gives the final outcome as a nasolacrimal duct. Again, I am repeating this and summarizing this process. The nasolacrimal duct develops from the fusion line which acts as a furrow or the groove between the lateral nasal process as well as the maxillary process of the first pharyngeal arc. Now, the complete surface of this furrow or the groove is lined by the ectoderm. Now, this surface ectoderm proliferate to form the solid ectodermal cord, and the cells of the solid ectodermal cord detach itself from the surface ectoderm and canalize to form the nasolacrimal duct as a final outcome. Now, the nasolacrimal duct actually it develops or it completes its development during the adult age. In the adult age, it shows its communication from the eye towards the nose. Now, at the level of the medial angle of the eye, it opens as a lacrimal sac, which is the most widened part of the nasolacrimal duct, and in the level of the nose, it opens into the inferior meatus. Thus, it forms the communicating link between your eye as well as nose. Many times this question comes to our mind that whenever the tear comes into your eyes, how they also drain out from your nose. That means there must be some connecting link occurs between these two structures. Now, this connecting link of this structure is the nasolacrimal duct. Now, after the formation of the nasolacrimal duct, I am taking the other topic, that is the development of the nasal cavities. Now, the nasal cavities, if you summarize the previous diagram during the developmental embryo, that again developing embryo, and then there is a in between there is a stomatodeum and lower part is a foregut is there, these two bulging, and in between there is a formation of the various other structure of the face used to be developed. Now we are concerned about the part of the developing brain. You will look into that there in the frontonasal process. If you remember the previous diagrams of the face development, the frontonasal process is laterally bounded by the two nasal pits. Now, two nasal pits, they sink over the surface and they form the nasal cavities. The nasal pits later on at the beginning of the 6th week of the intrauterine life, these nasal pits, they start ingrooving dorsally and get into the deep part, forms the primitive nasal cavity. I have also written that their direction of the development, that is the dorso-ventral, is there. Now, this primitive nasal cavity, it is separated from the developing brain as well as from the future oropharynx by the thin membrane, that is the oronasal membrane. Now, this oronasal membrane, it also carries its interior part as a portion of the primitive palate is there. Now, as this membrane ruptures and totally dissolved, it remains present as a primitive concha at the end of the 6th week of the intrauterine life is there. Then the development of the primitive palate, it all ultimately parallelly goes towards the anterior side is there. Now the disappearance of the oronasal membrane brings the communication part between the nasal cavity as well as your oral cavity is there. Now, later on, what would happen? The development of the palate keeps going on and it finishes at some stage and it separates the two compartments. First is the nasal cavity, other one is the oral cavity is there. Now, nasal cavity, when it separates from the oral cavity through the development of the secondary as well as the primitive palate is there, it is totally further lined by the various epithelial tissue is there. Its roof of this nasal cavity is lined by the specialized epithelium whose cord also act as a olfactory epithelium. Olfactory epithelium, and the nasal concha, they used to be developed from the diverticulum of the nasal walls are there. Now, this is the actual development of the nasal cavity is there. One thing you have to remember that the development of the nasal cavity starts from the frontal. As the growth of the frontonasal process starts, the nasal pits ultimately start more coming towards each other medially. Now, if we again, I am summarizing this part. As the formation of the nasal pit, they start sinking towards the surface. Ultimately, this groove get narrow and forms the primitive nasal cavity. From the primitive nasal cavity, there is a connecting link between the oral cavity as well as the nasal cavity by the oronasal membrane. When this membrane shrinks as at the end of the 6th week of the intrauterine life and disappear, then it ultimately gives the communication between these two cavities. Later on, as the parallel development of the palate, which we will discuss into the next video, in that divides the final outcome of these two cavities and separate them. Upper one is the nasal and lower one is the oral cavities there. Then nasal cavity is totally confined with the nasal epithelium is there, or the olfactory epithelium is there. It's more specialized at the level of the roof of this nasal cavity and forms the oral olfactory epithelium is there, and its anterior part that develops into the anterior nasal nares is there. Now the most important structures which contribute in the formation of that is the medial as well as the lateral nasal processes. Medial and lateral nasal processes. If you remember, I will just draw the diagrams. There is a development. This is the primitive diagram, only to make you clear what these are there. This is the frontonasal process. These are the nasal pits. This is the lateral nasal process, and this is the medial nasal process. Now, as these shrinks, that ultimately brings the actual formation of the nasal cavities there. Then comes the how the development of the external nares or which structures contribute into the development of this. If you see this diagram, the bridge of the nose that is formed from the frontonasal process. As we moving downwards, the sides or the lateral sides as well as the ala of the nose, they are developed from the lateral nasal process, if you remember this structure. And the tip of the nose as well as the dorsum, center part of the that develops from the medial nasal process. That means this structure. So in nutshell, frontonasal process along with the lateral as well as the medial nasal process, they contribute into the formation of the nasal cavities, but its actual development is completed by the development of the palate, which ultimately brings the boundaries or separating the two cavities, that is nasal as well as the oral cavity. Hope you summarized and understand the development of the naso-lacrimal duct as well as the nasal cavity. The development of the palate I will take into my next video.